Welcome to our deep dive today. We are going to be cracking open the Book of Colossians,
Okay.
specifically chapters 1 through 4,
All right.
and we'll be using the Net Bible translation and its insightful translator notes.
Sounds good.
I'm fascinated by Colossians because it tackles this timeless challenge, how to live out your faith in a world full of all these different ideas and philosophies.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head.
Yeah.
Paul, the author of Colossians, wasn't just writing some kind of theological treatise.
Right.
You know, he was addressing very real issues that the Colossian church was facing. They were grappling with these questions like, how do we reconcile our faith in Christ with all these prevailing philosophies of our time?
And that tension is what makes Colossians so relevant, even today, right?
Totally.
We are constantly bombarded with different worldviews, belief systems.
Yeah.
So how does Paul approach this in his letter?
Well, he starts by setting the stage in the opening verses of chapter 1. Paul, along with Timothy, expresses his deep affection for the Colossians.
Oh, wow.
Praising their faith and love.
Yeah.
It's almost like he's building a bridge of trust before diving into all the meatier topics.
And there's this warmth in his greeting. He even mentions Epaphras, who first shared the gospel with the Colossians.
Right.
It makes you realize these weren't just these abstract theological ideas being debated.
Right.
There were real relationships.
Yes.
And a sense of community at stake.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's worth noting, the translator's notes point out that the term brothers in this context likely refers to both men and women.
Interesting.
Which suggests a more inclusive understanding of community than we sometimes assume.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
It challenges some of the traditional assumptions about the role of women in the early church.
Right.
But getting back to Paul, he goes on to share this beautiful prayer for the Colossian believers.
Yeah, beautiful prayer.
What stands out to you in that prayer?
What strikes me is Paul's emphasis on spiritual maturity and a deep experiential knowledge of God's will. He's not just concerned with them knowing about God.
Right.
He wants them to understand God's will and live it out in a way that bears fruit in their lives.
So it's about more than just head knowledge.
Yes.
It's about living out your faith in a tangible way.
Exactly. And this leads us into one of the central themes of Colossians.
Right.
The supremacy of Christ.
Okay.
In chapter 1, verses 15 to 20, Paul uses this powerful poetic language to describe Christ as the image of the invisible God.
Okay.
The firstborn over all creation.
Wow.
The one in whom all things hold together.
Okay. Unpack that a bit for me.
Yeah.
What does it mean to say that Christ is the firstborn over all creation? I mean, wasn't God always there?
That's where the translator's notes are helpful.
Okay.
They explain that firstborn in this context doesn't just refer to a chronological order of birth. It signifies a preeminence, a supreme rank.
Right.
Christ is not just part of creation. He's the source.
Okay.
The foundation. The one through whom everything came into being.
So it's a statement about Christ's ultimate authority.
Yes.
And power.
Precisely.
Okay.
And this passage also emphasizes Christ's role in reconciling all things to God through his sacrifice on the cross.
Right.
It's a reconciliation that extends even to the heavenly realms.
Wow, that's a powerful image.
Yeah.
Christ bridging the gap between humanity and God.
Yeah.
Bringing everything back into harmony.
It's beautiful.
But then Paul takes a bit of a turn, right?
He does.
He starts warning the Colossians about these false philosophies that were creeping into the church.
Right.
Yeah.
In chapter 2, Paul issues a strong warning against what he calls empty, deceitful philosophy based on human tradition and the elemental spirits of the world. It's clear he sees these philosophies as a direct threat to their understanding of Christ and his supremacy.
That phrase, elemental spirits, is intriguing.
Yes.
What exactly did Paul have in mind?
That's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
The translator's notes suggest several possible interpretations.
Okay.
Elemental spirits could refer to the material elements themselves.
Okay.
Almost like a pre-scientific understanding of the forces of nature.
So almost like people were worshiping nature instead of God.
That's one possibility.
Okay.
Another interpretation is that these elemental spirits were understood as spiritual forces, perhaps angelic beings or demonic entities that influenced the physical world.
So it could be a warning against getting caught up in the occult.
Right.
or esoteric practices that were prevalent at the time.
Exactly. And you have to remember, this was a world steeped in various spiritualities and mystery religions.
Right.
The Colossians were living in this pluralistic society where many different belief systems coexisted.
It makes you wonder what specific philosophies Paul was concerned about.
Right.
Do the translator notes give us any clues?
Well, while they don't mention specific philosophical schools by name, the notes do point out that some of these philosophies promoted asceticism and legalism, emphasizing strict rules and rituals as a means of spiritual attainment.
Okay, so it's possible that some people in the Colossian church were being influenced by these ideas.
It's very possible.
Maybe even trying to blend them with their Christian faith.
That's a very plausible scenario.
Yeah.
And it's something we still see today, right?
Oh, totally.
This tendency to mix and match spiritual ideas,
right,
or to water down the core tenets of our faith, to fit in with prevailing cultural trends.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
It seems like Paul was trying to help the Colossians discern what was truly of God.
Yes.
And what was ultimately a distraction from the centrality of Christ.
Yes, and he does that by making this bold statement.
Okay.
All the fullness of deity lives in bodily form in Christ.
Well,
he's emphasizing the complete divinity of Christ, refuting any attempt to diminish his significance.
So he's drawing a clear line in the sand.
Exactly.
There's no middle ground here.
Right.
Either Christ is fully God, or he's not.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this was a crucial point of contention.
Right.
Because some of the philosophies infiltrating the church were trying to suggest that Christ was just this lesser divine being.
Right.
A kind of intermediary between God and humanity, but not fully God himself.
Right.
Paul vehemently opposes this, arguing that the fullness of God dwells in Christ.
It's amazing how these theological debates from the first century still resonate today.
I know, it's incredible.
We are still grappling with questions about the nature of Christ and his significance.
Absolutely.
And I think that's what makes studying a book like Colossians so valuable.
Yeah.
It gives us insights into how early Christians wrestled with these foundational questions and provides a framework for thinking through these issues in our own time.
I agree.
So where does Paul go from here?
That's a great question.
How does he guide the Colossians in living out their faith in light of all these challenges?
That's a great question, and it leads us into the practical application of these theological truths, which we'll explore in the next part of our deep dive.
Right.
But before we move on, is there anything that's particularly struck you so far in these opening chapters?
You know what stood out to me is how Paul skillfully blends theological depth with a genuine pastoral concern for the Colossians. He's not just lecturing them from afar.
Right.
He's engaging with their real-life struggles.
Yeah.
And offering guidance for navigating a complex world.
I agree.
There's a real warmth and authenticity to his writing that transcends the centuries.
Yeah.
And makes his message resonate even today.
Absolutely.
Well, I'm definitely eager to hear what he has to say next.
Me too.
Let's take a short break, and then we'll dive back into the second part of our deep dive into Colossians.
Sounds good.
All right, so we're back.
Yes.
We've explored the foundation of Paul's message to the Colossians.
Right.
Christ's supremacy in a world of all these competing philosophies.
Yeah.
What happens next?
Well, Paul transitions into what I like to call the action section of Colossians.
Okay.
He lays out some practical instructions for how to actually live out this transformed life in Christ.
Right.
Especially in the midst of all those competing ideas.
Give me an example.
Yeah.
What kind of practical instructions are we talking about?
Well, in chapter 2... starting around verse 20, he uses this striking image of putting off the old self and putting on the new self.
It's like a spiritual wardrobe change, right?
It is.
Out with the old, in with the new.
Yeah.
But what does that look like practically? I mean, I can't just go to the spiritual closet and pick out a new personality.
That's a great question, and it's something that has fascinated theologians and everyday Christians for centuries.
Right.
It's not about pretending to be someone you're not, but about this fundamental change in your core being, a transformation that starts from the inside out.
So if it's not just about outward actions,
right,
what does putting off the old self actually involve?
Paul gives us some clues. He talks about getting rid of anger, rage, malice, slander, and obscene talk.
Wow,
Those are all behaviors that stem from our old sinful nature.
Right.
putting them off means actively choosing to resist those impulses.
Okay.
To let go of the things that damage our relationships and ourselves.
So it's about recognizing those negative patterns in our lives and making a conscious effort to replace them with something better.
Exactly.
But what about putting on the new self?
Yeah.
What does that look like in day-to-day life?
Paul offers a beautiful list of virtues to clothe ourselves with.
Okay.
Compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, patience, and forgiveness.
Okay.
These qualities reflect the character of Christ himself.
So it's not just about getting rid of the bad stuff.
Right.
It's about actively cultivating positive virtues that reflect our new identity in Christ. You got it.
And one of the most powerful aspects of this transformation is that it's not just an individual pursuit.
Right.
It has implications for how we relate to others.
Absolutely.
So how does this new self impact our relationships?
Sure.
Give me some specific examples.
Well, Paul talks about bearing with one another and forgiving each other.
Okay.
This suggests a willingness to overlook offenses.
Yeah.
To extend grace, even when it's difficult.
Right.
It also implies this commitment to working through conflicts in a healthy way.
Yeah.
Rather than letting bitterness and resentment fester.
And that can be really challenging.
It can.
Especially in those close relationships where we tend to get on each other's nerves.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It takes humility and this conscious effort to choose forgiveness and reconciliation. But it's in those moments of grace that we truly reflect the love of Christ.
Okay, I'm starting to see how these seemingly abstract theological ideas actually play out in the messy realities of life.
They do. But there's another aspect of this transformation that Paul emphasizes, right?
Yes, there is.
The idea of unity.
You're exactly right.
Yeah.
Paul urges the Colossians to transcend their cultural and social divisions.
Okay.
Seeing each other as equals in Christ.
Right.
Remember, this is a time when society was deeply divided along lines of ethnicity, social status, and religious background.
So how does Paul address those divisions in his letter?
That's a great question.
I mean, those are some pretty deep-seated prejudices he's dealing with.
He breaks down those barriers by reminding the Colossians that in Christ, those distinctions fade away.
Yeah.
He says things like, there is neither Jew nor Greek slave, nor free male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus.
Wow, that's a radical statement for his time.
It is.
It's like he's laying the groundwork for a whole new kind of community.
Exactly.
One where those old categories no longer define us.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And this vision of unity is not just some idealistic dream. Paul gives specific examples of how this unity plays out in everyday life.
Like what?
Well, he addresses different groups within the Colossian community, offering instructions for how they should relate to each other. For example, he talks about the roles of husbands and wives, parents and children, even masters and slaves.
Ah, yes, the famous household codes.
Yeah.
These sections can be a bit tricky to navigate.
They can.
Especially from our modern perspective.
I agree.
How should we approach those passages today?
It's important to acknowledge the historical context.
Okay.
These codes reflect the social structures of Paul's time.
Right.
And we have to be careful not to impose our 21st century values onto them.
So it's not about endorsing those hierarchical structures, but about understanding the principles behind them.
Right. And if you look closely, you see that even within those existing social structures, Paul emphasizes mutual respect and responsibility. For example, husbands are called to love their wives as Christ loved the church.
Right.
Which is a pretty high standard.
It's not about dominance or control.
No.
But about self-sacrificial love.
Exactly. Yep. And fathers are urged not to provoke their children to anger, but to bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord.
So even in the parent-child relationship, there's emphasis on respect and understanding.
There is.
Not just blind obedience.
Right.
What about the instructions regarding slaves and masters? Those are particularly challenging.
They are.
Given our modern understanding of equality.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But even here, Paul emphasizes justice and fairness.
Okay.
Masters are told to treat their slaves justly and fairly.
Right.
Recognizing that they too have a master in heaven.
It's almost like he's planting seeds of a more egalitarian understanding of relationships.
Yeah.
Even within the constraints of his time.
I think that's a very perceptive observation. You can see how Paul's vision of unity in Christ challenges the existing social order and points toward a more just and equitable future.
It's a reminder that the gospel has implications for every aspect of our lives.
It does.
Even our social and political structures.
And that's something we'll continue to explore as we move into the concluding section of Colossians.
Before we do that, I want to touch on something that really struck me in this section.
No.
Paul's emphasis on forgiveness and reconciliation. It's so easy to get caught up in our own hurts and grievances.
It is.
But Paul reminds us that forgiveness is essential for both our own spiritual well-being and the health of our relationships.
I agree.
It's one of the most challenging,
it is,
but also one of the most liberating aspects of the Christian life.
It really is.
Well, I'm definitely feeling challenged and inspired in equal measure.
Me too.
Shall we take a moment to gather our thoughts?
Yeah, let's do that.
Before we dive into the final part of our deep dive.
That sounds like a good idea.
It's amazing how much richness and depth we find in these ancient texts.
They truly have a timeless quality that speaks to the core of the human experience.
All right, I'm ready to see what treasures we uncover in the final chapters of Colossians. Okay, we're in the home stretch now, the final chapter of Colossians.
Yeah.
I'm curious, what kind of parting words does Paul leave the Colossians with?
It's interesting because it's not just one big grand finale. You know, it's this blend of practical advice, personal greetings, and a really poignant reminder of his own circumstances.
Right.
It all comes together to paint this picture of early Christian life that's both inspiring and really human.
What kind of practical advice does he give?
Well, he emphasizes the importance of prayer, urging them to devote yourselves to prayer, being watchful and thankful.
Right.
It's like he's reminding them that their transformed life in Christ isn't a solo mission. It's rooted in a constant connection with God.
It's that idea of staying plugged into the source of our strength.
Exactly. And then he talks about their conduct towards outsiders, urging them to walk in wisdom toward outsiders, making the best use of the time.
What do you think he means by making the best use of the time? It sounds almost urgent.
Yeah.
There's a sense of limited opportunity.
I think you're picking up on something important there.
Okay.
Remember, the early Christians were living in a world that was often hostile to their faith.
Right.
They faced persecution, misunderstanding, and social pressure to conform.
Right.
So Paul's encouragement to make the best use of the time could be a call to seize every opportunity to share the gospel, to live out their faith authentically, and to make a difference in the world, knowing that time is precious.
Wow, that puts things in perspective.
Yeah.
It's like a reminder that we are not just called to believe certain things.
Right.
We are called to live them out, to embody the gospel in a way that impacts the world around us.
You got it.
And he emphasizes the importance of their speech, saying, "Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person."
Right.
It's like he's saying, choose your words carefully. Make them count.
Yeah.
Especially when you are talking to people who don't share your faith.
Right.
Yeah.
There's a wisdom and a gentleness that he's encouraging.
Yeah.
It's not about being argumentative or forceful, but about speaking truth with grace and understanding in a way that invites dialogue rather than shuts it down.
That's such a relevant challenge for us today.
It is.
Especially in our increasingly polarized culture.
Right.
It's easy to get caught up in the heat of the moment.
It is.
But Paul reminds us that our words have power, and we should use them wisely and thoughtfully.
I agree.
And then as we move towards the end of the letter, he starts sending these personal greetings.
Yes.
Almost like he's wrapping up a phone call with friends.
Yeah, I noticed that.
There are a lot of names in this section.
Yeah.
It almost feels like a who's who of the early church.
Well, it reminds us that these weren't just abstract theological ideas being debated.
Right.
They were embedded in real relationships, a network of people who were supporting and encouraging one another in their faith.
And some of these names are familiar, right?
They are.
Like Tychicus, who we encountered in other letters of Paul.
Yeah.
It creates this sense of continuity and connection across different parts of the New Testament.
Exactly.
And there's Onesimus, who we learned about in the Book of Philemon. Remember, he was a runaway slave who came to faith through Paul's ministry.
Yeah. A powerful story.
It's a reminder that these letters weren't written in a vacuum. They were part of the messy, real-life dramas of the early church.
They were.
And it's amazing to think that these seemingly ordinary people were playing a part in shaping the course of Christian history.
It really is incredible.
And then there's Aristarchus, Paul's fellow prisoner, and Mark, the cousin of Barnabas.
All right.
I remember Mark had a bit of a rocky start in his ministry.
He did.
But here he is, still working alongside Paul and being welcomed back into the fold.
It's a beautiful picture of grace.
It's a reminder that even in the early church, there were disagreements, setbacks, and people had to work through their differences.
Yeah.
It makes the whole narrative feel so much more human and relatable.
It does.
And then we come to Epaphras, who we met earlier as the one who first brought the gospel to the Colossians.
Right.
He is commended for his dedication to praying for the Colossians' spiritual growth and maturity.
Yeah, their spiritual father.
It's like he's their spiritual father.
Yeah.
Rooting for them from afar and interceding on their behalf.
It speaks volumes about the importance of prayer and the power of intercession.
It's not just about asking for things, but about standing with each other in faith and lifting each other up to God.
Beautifully said.
And then there's this intriguing detail, almost like a postscript.
Yeah.
Where Paul instructs the Colossians to share the letter with the church in Laodicea and to read their letter in return.
It's like an early form of interchurch communication.
It makes you wonder what was in that Laodicean letter.
Unfortunately, we don't have that letter. It's lost to history.
Yeah.
But it's a reminder that these early churches were connected.
Yeah.
Sharing their experiences, their insights, and their struggles.
And then as he signs off, there's that one last poignant reminder.
Yeah.
Remember my chains.
It's a sobering note reminding the Colossians of the cost of discipleship.
Right.
The reality of persecution that Paul and many early Christians faced.
Yeah.
It's a call to persevere, to stand firm in their faith even when it's difficult.
Wow, what a powerful way to end the letter.
It is.
It's a reminder that faith isn't just about abstract ideas.
Right.
It's lived out of the trenches of real life, often in the face of opposition and hardship.
Absolutely.
I think that's one of the things that makes Colossians so compelling.
Yeah.
It's this blend of theological depth, practical wisdom, and personal authenticity. It gives us a glimpse into the challenges and triumphs of the early church. And it offers guidance for navigating the complexities of faith in our own time.
It really does.
I have to say, this deep dive into Colossians has been incredibly enlightening.
It has.
It's challenged me to think more deeply about what it means to live as a Christian in a world that's constantly pulling us in different directions.
I've appreciated the opportunity to explore these things with you.
Me too.
I always find that discussing these ancient texts with others brings new insights and fresh perspectives.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Colossians. We will see you next time.